I hardly ever read the cookbook anymore. Sure, some people say you should read it all the time, especially when you're going to cook something, but that sort of thing just isn't for me. When I first became a chef, of course, I read the cookbook all the time. In fact, before I was a chef, it was the cookbook that showed me how to become one. I'd sit and read it for hours on end, poring over all those recipes, wishing I could bake and fry and whip up all those delicious sounding dishes. Then I got to the part of the cookbook that tells you how to become a chef, and I went right ahead and followed the directions. It was probably the happiest day of my life, come to think of it. During those first months, I almost always had the cookbook under my arm wherever I went. People would ask me what the book was and why I was carrying it around, and I practically glowed as I told them about how I'd just become a chef. I was so happy. I wanted everyone else to become a chef too. After 2 or 3 years, though, my study of the cookbook began to fall off. After all, I figured, I was getting pretty good at this chef stuff now. I'd made most of everything from beef stroganoff to petit fours, and they hadn't turned out too badly. Once in a while I'd accidentally skip an ingredient or use a pastry whip incorrectly and the dish would flop. But I was getting quite a reputation as a cook, and I decided I didn't need to read the cookbook so much. Already I'd stopped carrying the unwieldy thing around with me, and now I stopped reading a portion of the general cooking instructions each day. I mean, so much of it was boring, especially the first 2/3, which told about the history of cooking and how they used to do things in the old days. Who needs that? I asked myself. This is now. We've got microwaves and food processors, not brick ovens. Besides, I was just too busy for that stuff. To be a good chef, surely it would be enough just to cook. I didn't have to read and reread the cookbook too. Next, I started to cook without reading the recipes first. I'd already read most of the really popular ones like pizza and scrambled eggs at least once. I mean, why bother to read them again? So I'd whip up a chocolate cake without peeking at the book, and to my surprise and pleasure, it would turn out okay. True, sometimes I'd leave out the baking powder or used too much flour, but most of the time it was at least edible. Before long I was making more complicated recipes without the book, things like soufflés and turkey tetrazzini. In some cases I never read the recipes at all, but I'd heard a lecture in the subject somewhere. Sometimes I hadn't even heard a lecture, but I figured I knew enough about cooking to wing it. I'd substitute ingredients and guess at baking temperatures, and sometimes the results weren't exactly the sort of thing you'd enter into a state fair. Once I came up with chocolate chip cookies that you could drink through a straw, but they didn't taste too awful, I guess. Eventually I couldn't remember many recipes, so I began to invent my own. I thought they were pretty close to the originals, but couldn't be sure since I'd misplaced my copy of the cookbook. Some people didn't think much of the dishes I invented, licorice burritos for instance, but I didn't care. What was I supposed to do anyway? Memorise recipes? A few of my cooking friends criticised me, saying I ought to read the cookbook more. I tried to calm them down by buying a brand new copy, a big one edged in gold. I brought it to the Cooking Society meetings, making sure everyone saw it. But I didn't open it, of course. I did read cooking-related books, stuff about stoves and diets and grocery shopping. Some of those were quite interesting and had pictures, which is more than I could say for the cookbook itself. Gradually, as my friends pestered me to get back into my cookbook, I attended Cooking Society meetings less and less. When a friend would express concern about my interest in cooking, I'd tell them I was watching one of those TV cooking shows regularly. And I was, for a while. But my interest in cooking waned. Finally, I stopped hanging around the kitchen altogether. These days I don't do much cooking. If I get really hungry, I warm up a TV dinner. Once in a while I'll get into a bind and have to whip up a hamburger, But the old zeal just isn't there anymore. My old cooking friends just shake their heads now when they see me on the street. They look at each other as if to say, "Wow, I bet he can't even remember how to boil water." What a bunch of know-it-alls. Of course I can remember how to boil water. I just can't remember why.